Hello and welcome back to part 3 of our reader response series, Teaching the Reader, Not the Text, a fresh look at response. My name is Melinda Clifford. I'm the coordinator for the elementary and secondary English language arts programs at the Ministry of Education, and I am joined today once again by my wonderful colleague, Dawn.
Hi, I'm Dawn Uniat. I'm a teacher from the Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board, currently on a loan of service working with Melinda on the ELA team.
So in this section of the workshop, we'll consider best practices and how they contribute to the development of reader response at the elementary and secondary levels. And we'll discuss text selections and explore a selection of children's and young adult literature that can encourage response and help students find deeper meaning as they read. Good practice makes for good response. So what have you seen in your practice that makes for good response? And what have you noticed that hinders response? Okay, so we're going to move into rethinking how we teach reading, and this has been adapted from Barnhouse and Vinton. This is a top 10 compilation of our findings from Barnhouse and Vinton's book. And as I've mentioned throughout this series of workshops, we were very inspired by Barnhouse and Vinton's What Readers Really Do. Their premise is that in order to better teach reading and in turn help students engage with and respond to texts, we need to make our thinking processes more visible. We need to encourage students to focus on the details and patterns and to construct meaning from those details through authentic connections and discussion of texts with others. In part 2, we looked at why so much response we see only scratches the surface, and we watched Kathy Kanzani from the Eastern Township School Board, who referred to the old way of doing response and how the product often came out looking like a botched cake. So in rethinking how we teach reading, we've chosen our top 10 ideas from Barnhouse and Vinton's book, which we'd like to share with you today. So they're not in any particular order or hierarchy, and we'll just start with the first one. So teaching the text. When we teach the text, we prompt and lead students to notice what the teacher notices and draw the same conclusions as the teacher. But when we teach the reader, we guide students to become aware and help them to think more deeply about what they notice and honor the conclusions that they draw from what they notice. When we teach the text, we do the thinking for the students. But when we teach the reader, we teach the thinking around the text and allow students to do that thinking for themselves. When we teach the text, we solve the problems for the students. But when we teach the reader, we facilitate problem solving in the classroom and around. When we teach the text, we front load background information or ask students to access their own background information as a matter of course. But when we teach the reader, we give students the opportunity and the tools to construct the world of the text from details the author provides. When we teach the text, we ask students to identify a single theme, such as friendship, once they've finished a text. But when we teach the reader, we teach students that themes emerge throughout a text as we discover what the author might be saying about the big ideas. When we teach the text, we have students write reading responses without letting them first explore their thoughts through talk. But when we teach the reader, we build in time for students to talk before writing, and that's even if we assign them any written work. When we teach the text, we think of reading responses as written assignments used to assess student comprehension. But when we teach the reader, we use students' authentic responses and reactions through talk and writing to help students dig deeper into texts. When we teach the text, we offer students a one-size-fits-all strategy for inferring. But when we teach the reader, we offer customized strategies for inferring. For example, they get to figure out the who and the what and the where of the text. Number 9, when we teach the text, we ask students to make text to self, text to text, text to the world connections as a matter of course. That goes back to the old model of response. But when we teach the reader, we ask students to make authentic connections within and beyond the text. And finally, number 10, when we teach the text, we plan lessons to teach standard comprehension strategies. But when we teach the reader, we plan lessons based on our assessment of the demands of a text. And now, Dawn, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about books.
Thank you, Melinda. And now my favorite part, because we are going to talk about books. On the Literacy Today website, there is a document called Teaching Ideas for Moving Students Forward in Reader Response, and it talks about selecting texts. It has a lot of helpful advice, like the importance of selecting texts that are engaging and meaningful for readers. They also recommend choosing texts that offer the right level of challenge for students with rich language, topics, and big ideas that resonate with them, interesting illustrations or graphics, books that encourage reflection and discussion. And it's worth taking a look at the document. It presents many suggestions for text types and reminds us to consider your purpose, students' needs and interests, and very important, student engagement. So we'd like to start with this book, The Patchwork Bike. And if you're not familiar with the book, you might want to pause this webinar and view a read aloud of the book by following the link on your screen or scanning the QR code. As you view the video, keep in mind the question, how do you think your students might relate to this book? And at first, this might seem like a very different world from what your students know, but consider some of the big ideas in this text. Your students might also love to ride their bikes. They might spend a lot of time with their siblings. Their parents might be fed up, just like their mom in this book. And your students might like to make things from found objects. And did you notice the bike's license plate? BLM. That's another kind of connection that your students might make with more of a worldview. Both of these books are especially good for critical reading, thinking about a worldview, taking a position on an issue. In I Didn't Stand Up, students can see themselves as well as other people who are different in some way. There are messages anyone can relate to, anti-bullying, standing up and speaking out when we see injustice. It's great for elementary, but could also be used in Cycle 1 secondary. At the back of the book, there's some excellent background information that can take your discussion quite far. The book was inspired by a poem called First They Came, written in the 1940s in Germany about the abuses enacted by the Nazis on a variety of groups, including the Jewish people, and how many people didn't, and they explained how many people did nothing to protect the innocent lives. The original poem can be found in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and there are many possibilities for follow-up discussion and activities. The sad little fact looks like a book for young readers, but actually it's about how facts might be distorted, hidden, or denied. It brings up issues like fake news. It's quite subtle, very rich with metaphors, and it could be used with Cycle 3 elementary students, but I think it would be even better for your secondary students. For reader response, we don't always have to address serious topics either. Both of these books can be used with elementary students, but they are complex enough to go into secondary. Sometimes books like these can be deceptively simple. Many of you probably know that. I'm going to start that again because I didn't mean to click. For reader response, we don't always have to address serious topics either. Both of these books can be used with elementary students, but they are complex enough to go into secondary. Sometimes books like these can be deceptively simple. Many of you probably know the true story of the Three Little Pigs, an interesting version of the classic story told from the wolf's point of view. The Cat, the Dog, Little Red is great for asking very open questions, like what do you think about the title? And what do you notice on the back of the book? Henry Holton and the Cranky Ballerina are for younger readers. They have big ideas that are quite obvious, but that might be an appropriate level of challenge for your grade 1 students. These books both address gender stereotypes. And here we have I Love My Purse. Most people would say that this book is about being yourself and expressing yourself in unique ways. Elementary students can probably find the big ideas quite easily in that one. Red, a Crayon Story, is a more metaphorical story, and it can be interpreted in quite a few different ways. It's really an interesting read. And at this point, I would invite you to view a read aloud of Red, a Crayon Story, and consider the big ideas that you see in the text, and also think about what clues lead to your interpretation. You can follow the URL or use the QR code. So what did you see in this story? There are many possibilities for interpretation. Differences, everyone has value, acceptance of others, being yourself, finding yourself, recognizing strengths and challenges. And is this a metaphor for being transgender? Have you ever done response with a wordless text? In Journey, the illustrations tell a lot, but there is still some room for interpretation and opportunities for discussion. Small Things is about anxiety, a good book for Cycle 3 elementary or for secondary students. It's quite interesting how the worries and anxieties are drawn, and almost everyone has them lurking over their shoulders. Some are small and some are overwhelmingly huge. And The Arrival by Sean Tan is a beautiful book for secondary students about an immigrant who tries to figure out his new country without knowing the language. Wordless texts require us to look closely and really notice what's going on in the illustrations. A lot of a story might be told with pictures, even when it has a written text. So remember, there is a lot of potential for response with these rich wordless texts. Here are some picture books for older students. Varmint is great for Cycle 3 and through to secondary. It has interesting crafting choices. Of note, the figurative language, setting, point of view. There are amazing illustrations in this book. It's an open-ended story, something that you read and reread with more to notice each time. And there's also a film version that you can find quite easily on YouTube. So you could use the book or the video for response or look at both versions. The Errand is unusual in that it's told in the second person. We don't see that very often. It's scary and creepy and dark, which is really appealing to a lot of students. Here we have some graphic texts for secondary. The Courage of Elfina is about a girl from Paraguay who goes to live with relatives in Montreal. We think her aunt is offering her an escape from a life of poverty, but she's actually entering a world of exploitation. And the book raises issues of child labor. It's really quite a powerful story. I Remember Beirut is a memoir, another good genre for response. It tells about growing up in a war-torn country, and it's beautifully illustrated. You'll notice on the cover how the children's hair is drawn. There's great attention to detail here. Anthologies are another great option for response. Sit is 11 short stories that span cultures and geography, featuring children in trying situations linked by the theme of sitting. The children face various challenges but find inner strength and agency that help them to cope. Child labor, access to education, and divorce are just some of the themes that are addressed here. Some of the stories are appropriate for Cycle 3 elementary and others are more for secondary students. I See Reality is for secondary Cycle 2. It's described as a collection of short stories about modern teen experiences, including romance, addiction, identity construction, and sexuality. It's great for exploring big ideas, crafting choices, as well as connections to their own experiences and worldview. In Meet Cute, we have 14 short stories, all based on romantic relationships, but that's where the similarities stop. We have different genres, different tones. They are not only boy meets girl stories, but all kinds of variations. And this is really of interest to all secondary levels. The stories in these anthologies include themes and issues that resonate with students, so it's easy for them to make connections. All of these encourage reflection and discussion on issues related to fairness, equity, and social justice. Many of the stories are useful when considering representations, bias, and stereotypes, which is an important part of critical reading. The authors and characters are from diverse social, cultural, and gender groups, and many of the texts encourage exploration of various crafting choices. So you can see there's a lot to work with in these anthologies. And here we have a couple more anthologies for secondary. The same editor for both of these texts. The second one has more feminist content. So Dreaming in Indian is a collection of pieces by contemporary Indigenous voices. You'll see many genres and issues represented here. Hashtag Not Your Princess is a collection of works by Indigenous women with a variety of text types. You have personal essays, poetry, comics, visual art, and this one also addresses a variety of topics, both great books. Poetry too can be a good option for response. Poems are often short texts that often have a lot to say. These examples here are for elementary, but they're humorous and they could work with older students as well if you're looking for something light, quick, and fun. And these are just chock full of figurative language. Here we have some poetry for secondary students. October Morning, the author wrote this collection of poems in response to the murder of Matthew Shepard, a gay man who was attacked and left to die. Many of the poems are inspired by quotes from a variety of sources, including Shepard's mother, the girlfriends of the accused, and from signs held by anti-gay protesters. The poems capture a range of emotions and perspectives, from the murderers to the fence onto which Shepard was left to die, and to Shepard himself. Poisoned Apples. This is a collection of poetry inspired by fairy tales with a modern feminist twist. In my classroom, it was one of the most popular books in my class library, and it disappeared at least twice. I had to keep replacing it because it was such a favorite book. The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one is for mature readers. A modern poetry collection. Free verse, lots to talk about in terms of structures and features, lots of symbolism, literary references to books like The Handmaid's Tale and The Hunger Games, very rich, but it addresses heavy topics like violence and sexual assault. So you really need to know your students and be aware of their triggers. We have to be really careful when we're recommending books that address sensitive topics, as you know. And here's just an example of one of the poems from The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one. And what are some of your favorite texts to use for response? If you're viewing the session with colleagues, you might want to take a minute to share. And for more information about the books we discussed and many more great texts, please visit Quebec Reading Connection or Consolations. The web addresses are there on your screen. And as we conclude, we'd ask you to consider how you address response in your own teaching practice. What are some of the best practices you use when teaching response? What strategies would you like to add to your repertoire? And has this presentation changed your thinking about teaching response? On this slide, you'll see some resources and support for ELA. You're probably familiar with the website Literacy Today, but we also have a Facebook group with the same name. I'd like to invite you to join our Literacy Today Facebook group. I know some of you have already joined, and thank you, but if you'd like to stay up to date with ELA professional development, our ORC Skills Toolkit, as well as a lot of other information that supports the ELA curriculum, you can pop Literacy Today into the search tab on Facebook and click Request to Join. Here is the reference list for this presentation. And if you have other questions or comments or feedback for us, please contact us at admin@literacytoday.ca. Thank you very much for joining us today.